thank you. This is not a political rally, but what a reception. So thank you very much for being here. I'm Joe Gary, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Broadway Buzz and Beauty and the Beast. It is a story as old as time. It's had magnificent incarnations, really, from the dawn of civilization to the present. You're seeing a production that is one of Disney's greatest triumphs. It's played to 35 million people in 21 countries. It's had 4 major national tours. It's currently at 97% capacity here at Playhouse Square, and it's had a triumphant tour. It is a reimagining of this classic show, and every critic that's perceived it and reviewed it has very strongly endorsed the idea that it is probably the best version of Beauty and the Beast that you're going to be able to see. So it is with great delight that I'd like to go back and say to you, once upon a time, far away and long ago. We all remember those wonderful evenings as a child when our grandmother or our father would tuck us in bed and we would be taken into a world of magic. And that's exactly, of course, what this show is. And Disney, of course, is the master of creating magic, not only in film, but certainly now on the stage. Probably one of the most ancient qualities that connect all of us in the world, so whether we're talking about India or Japan or the Zulus, we're all connected to the idea of the dream world or the magic world or the ability to enter into a fantasy place. You know, as children, our imaginations are absolutely ripe and ready to take on any level of fantasy. But the problem is, the older we get, and as we face the realities of life, we, of course, minimize our capacity to imagine and our capacity to dream. I'd like to go back and remind you that the oldest way of communicating in the arts was with the level of storytelling. So the fact that you grew up with a wonderful grandmother or grandfather or mother who told you wonderful tales or family sagas or the history of the family or the history of where your family came from, all of this is part of our own sort of history. And all of it was perpetuated through the idea of storytelling. So what I'd like to do, it's very rare that we talk about artists in terms of simply being storytellers, but to understand how the writer, the composer, the director really is a storyteller, manipulating your imagination takes you into the richest level of your dreaming. So let me just go back for a moment to very ancient concepts. And the reason I'm doing this is there's probably no modern presenter who understands these ancient concepts better than the Disney organization. So we go back to this idea that whether it was a chief, whether it was the leader of a tribe, whether it was the head of a family, the telling of oral tales existed, of course, in every culture. And one of the things that made the oral tale so beguiling was the fact of its fantasy, the fact that we were able to connect with things that we couldn't touch. Keep in mind, the basis of religion goes back to this. The parables in any religious book will lead to this idea of making the untouchable somehow touchable for us. And the same thing happened then with storytellers. They would tell tales about magic, they would tell tales about spells, they would tell tales about enchantment, and all of this would take us into a special and magical world. One of the great ways in which this was embellished was a device in ancient times that we now call automatism. And the phrase automatism literally means that we give lifelike characteristics to inanimate objects or animals. So in other words, the idea of a talking animal, a la Mickey Mouse, the idea of a talking tree, all of these concepts then clearly come from ancient tales. And the reason was in order to lead man to the unknown, we have to start with what we know. And even the ancient storytellers knew that. We have to start with our humanness. And so whether we're talking about the Greeks 5 centuries BC, when they were trying to humanize the gods, and they started telling mythic tales about the adventure of the gods, they realized that the more human they made the gods, the more accessible they were to the ancient Greeks. And the same thing was true with the Hindus, and the same thing was true with the Arabs. Every culture used this device to humanize that which we don't understand, which is our imagination. So in all of these ancient tales, keep in mind, there would be a storyteller. You can still go to rural India and sit under a banyan tree and have the entire village come and sit around and listen to a storyteller who will reveal the mysteries of one of their ancient writings, the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, and they will sit for hours and listen to these tales. Or you can go to present-day Bali and have children sit with children all night as they watch shadow puppets retell an ancient legend or an ancient Hindu legend, which is a part of their culture. So the thing that's important to realize is storytellers have always existed. And even before we had the written word, we had stories being told. I will share with you the idea that Beauty and the Beast really goes back to antiquity. And the stories were popular in India, they were popular in Egypt, and they were popular in Greece, 5,000 years before the birth of Christ. So the end result is these ancient stories, these parables, these allegories are common to all cultures. And really what the storyteller does is he learns how best to tell the tale. So that's what, of course, good playwriting is about. That's what a good novelist does. He has to be able to tell the story in some kind of provocative way. It is never the story itself. It's how the story is told. So be very sensitive to that, even as you watch this very simplistic love story. There are critics that say this is one of the greatest love stories. So whether we're thinking of it as a Greek legend or a Hindu story or the story of Beauty and the Beast, we can relate to this idea of inner beauty versus external beauty. Okay, so everything starts then with the storyteller. But what I want you to quickly realize too is that the story was told not only by speaking, but by singing and dancing. So even in the most ancient cultures, we had this tradition of blending dance and music and storytelling in the telling of the tale of the tribe, or how the group got to Hawaii from Tahiti, or whatever the ancient tale is that's being told. It almost inevitably was told with singing, dancing, and a storyline. So this is an ancient device. I mean, I just want to remind you, for example, in the Greek culture, as they were moving from an oral tradition to a written tradition, again, we're talking about 5 centuries BC, Aristophanes would start to write very funny, pertinent comedies using stock characters from all of the ancient stories. These same stock characters you're going to see in the show today. And when Aristophanes wrote this 5 centuries BC, remember, he would use titles of shows like The Clouds, The Frogs, The Birds, and they would tell the story through the eyes of the birds, through the eyes of clouds, through the eyes of frogs. And the end result was it freed the storyteller in being able to make very pertinent and accurate observations. So all of these ancient traditions really will come together in the work that you're seeing today. After the Greeks did this, if we jump to the Middle Ages, we had this whole movement of street theater that was called the Commedia dell'arte, where people performed at fairs or street corners. They would sing, dance, chant. They would add topical references to their stories. But again, they were using the same ancient stereotypes that you will still see being used in the show this evening. So we followed in that tradition of sort of popular street entertainments that would take these ancient tales and retell them in some kind of contemporary way. Shakespeare, of course, several centuries later would do the same thing. He loved the idea of enchantment, the idea of that which is mystic, that which is magical. Think of Midsummer Night's Dream. Think of the characters of Puck or Ariel or Bottom, or the characters that would morph or transform. That idea is very important. So the central image in the show you're seeing tonight of the beast, of the idea of the prince being buried in the beast, and then the prince being brought back to life, that transformation, that morphing is one of the most ancient ideas of enactment. And it goes all the way back to the earliest examples of performance. Okay, so we have this idea then that there is this long tradition of sort of stereotyped characters, stereotyped situations, of famous tales that have morals or have a morality to them or have a parable quality to them and somehow can elevate us and make us see the world in a new way. And that's, of course, exactly what happens with Beauty and the Beast. So as we talk about it, then I'll give you more examples of how ancient ideas would very strongly impact what Disney is doing, not only in this show, but in the body of all of the work that he has created. Okay, so Beauty and the Beast then. Let me give you just sort of a quick chronology of the storyline of the legend of Beauty and the Beast. Actually, as I told you, you can go to the Indian culture, especially in Hindu writings. There are lots of examples of the beautiful young girl falling in love with the deformed or partially human God figure that is both animal and man. So the idea of Beauty and the Beast exists very strongly in the Hindu culture. It exists very strongly in the Greek culture, in the ancient culture, Eros and Psyche, and endless stories of gods who are half man, half animal, like the centaurs. And then in terms of Arabic cultures, going all the way back again to pre-Christ, there's very strong examples of the idea of the girl falling in love with somehow the deformed figure. So, here we are thinking that we see a movie like King Kong, and King Kong is really the same story, and it's an ancient legend. So in the case of Beauty and the Beast, it really goes back to antiquity. But what happened specifically in about the mid-18th century, a French woman started collecting fairy tales and publishing them in very literary forms. Her name was Madame La Prince de Beaumont, and she took tales. One of her most famous tales then was La Belle et la Bête, which is, of course, Beauty and the Beast. And she would tell the story in a very literate way, in a very poetic way. It was presented in an anthology that was highly illustrated. And so starting in the mid-1700s, children were falling in love with this incredible young woman who had the capacity to see beauty in ugliness. And it became one of the great love stories. And we would follow that through. In Germany, it would take another form. In Italy, it would take another form. And there are examples of this tale developing from the mid-18th century to the present. Now, let us look at Disney and what the Disney Corporation did with this show. Okay, so the time is 1991. And we're talking about the birth of the animated movie version of Beauty and the Beast. Now, keep in mind, by this point, by 1991, the Disney empire had already established itself as the ultimate dream factory of the world. And Disney had created all of those brilliant masterpieces that children in cultures everywhere in the world grew up with. So whether it was Snow White or Cinderella, we all have this long tradition of growing up with the Disney mythology. He would Disneyfy the stories. He would take the stories and make them his in the creation of the animations that he created and all of those famous movies. So let me show you just briefly what he did with Beauty and the Beast. Let me introduce the book writer for the movie cartoon version of Beauty and the Beast. Her name is Linda Wolverton, and she is the book writer of the musical that you see tonight. She spent 3 years researching, developing all of the various versions of Beauty and the Beast. Again, I go back to the idea of storyteller. It's not the story, it's how the story is told that's important. And she would make several changes to the traditional storyline of Beauty and the Beast. In the original storyline, Beauty has 3 sisters, and they chose not to develop that idea in the cartoon version of it. We have seen that in Cinderella with the wicked stepsisters. We have seen it in countless other parables. So the choice of deleting the sisters was very interesting. And instead, Linda Wolverton created an antagonist, a young man named Gaston. And he is one of the central characters in the show you'll see tonight. He is the villain you love to hate. He's exceedingly handsome. He's the epitome of male masculinity, but he's ultimately everything that we hate in the nature of this beautiful godlike man. He really is a beast inside, a wonderful juxtaposition. So she creates then an antagonist, this sort of hero with the biggest muscles, the man that most men loved and women swooned over, but underneath he was a very insensitive and callous beast. So this makes for a wonderful storyline to be developed not only in the cartoon, but in the delightful presentation that you'll see in the musical version tonight. Linda Wolverton did several other little things that were really quite massive and very indicative of what the Disney empire would do. In the real story of Beauty and the Beast, when Beauty goes to stay with the Beast, her father has been captured. The Beast releases the father only with the idea that the beautiful daughter will stay in the castle as his prisoner, and that's the major storyline of the tale. But keep in mind, Linda Wolverton was very wise in not only having these 2 characters in the castle, she decided to create this whole body of characters that have been transformed into a chandelier, into a clock, into a feather duster. So in other words, we go back to the most ancient of ideas, this idea of transformation, this idea of giving human characteristics to inanimate objects or animals. And so in the story that Disney tells, we have what are called the enchanted objects. And here we have a candelabra who is really like Maurice Chevalier. He's a very sassy French gentleman. He's given one of the greatest musical numbers, not only in cartoons, but on the Broadway stage, when he gets to sing Be Our Guest. But what you see with the enchanted objects is that we keep watching them become less human. And by the end of the show, they make a transformation, and there's a brilliant song in the show called Human Again, when they once again have been transformed. So again, all of these ideas are Linda Wolverton's. They were developed through the Disney organization. They literally took 3 years, the phrase is, to storyboard the story. Literally, keep in mind, when cartoons are made, they literally draw every frame. So the amount of detail that goes into this work is extraordinary, and the amount of research in terms of creating the right environment, creating the right atmosphere, creating the right dialogue, establishing the right songs. But it was really all Linda Wolverton. In the very clever way, she decided to adjust the story so that it made it so much more visual, and it really made it much more ancient. They used more of the ideas of magic, transformation, enchantment, spells. All of these are part of the most ancient of cultures. So they created an absolutely magnificent movie. They used a composer, Alan Menken, who wrote an incredible score for the movie, and his partner, Howard Ashman, wrote brilliant lyrics for the show. In fact, when the movie came out in 1991, it was so successful, it won the Academy Award for Best Single Song and Best Score. And it was the only time up to that point that an animated film had been nominated in the Best Picture category. And what would happen that would transform Disney, that would move Disney to Broadway, was an article that Frank Rich wrote in the New York Times. Frank Rich, as you know, was one of the most powerful theater critics we had in the 1990s. And in 1991, when he gave his estimate of the year of the New York theater, he said, "I'm happy to announce that we have the best music I've heard in a musical in 10 years. The good news is that all of the songs are brilliant. The bad news is it isn't on Broadway, it's in a Disney cartoon." And of course, he was referring to Beauty and the Beast. And so the end result was the Disney organization, always smart about raising money, better than anyone else, their ears perked up immediately and they went, whoa, maybe Disney should have a place on Broadway. And so what was created then in 1993 was the Disney Theatricals, which was dedicated then to taking ideas, the body of their great movies, and turning them into live entertainments. Now keep in mind, Disney had been playing with this idea for quite a period of time with Disneyland. And they would hire very smart, very sophisticated young directors, choreographers, scenic designers. They would give them very large sums of money, and they would create these large, massive, popular entertainments, like playing to 2,000 people, in an hour, and then the group would leave, and then another group would come in, and they play it 8 times a day at Disneyland. You've all experienced some of these shows, which are really extraordinary. So the end result was Disney really did have a body of very talented artists who were dedicated to working in the theater, directing, choreographing, creating visuals for the stage, for the Disneyland productions. So the end result was the heads of Disney went to their staff and they picked the most aspiring and popular young director at Disneyland. His name was Rob Roth, and Rob Roth is the director of the show you'll be seeing tonight. But he was hired at the time then to develop Beauty and the Beast as a production for Broadway. And again, Disney has always been very careful how they develop projects. Keep in mind, one of their works actually was developed here at Playhouse Square. It was a work called On the Record. But in this case, being their first Broadway venture, they worked with Rob Roth and his staff. They made him storyboard the show in the same way you would do a cartoon. Now keep in mind, no Broadway show could afford to do this. No Broadway producer could afford to take artists and say, okay, I'll give you over a year to give me absolutely detailed drawings about every moment of the show that you're planning. So they literally storyboarded the stage version of the musical, having all this collaboration with the same team working together that had worked at Disneyland for several years. You'll see all their work. Read the bios in the program tonight of the costumer, the lighting designer, the set designer. They all had years of working together prior to doing this project. So the end result was that they came up with a really amazing show, which they presented in Houston, at Theater Under the Stars. It was very carefully monitored and reviewed, and they got very strong audience reaction. And then ultimately they moved the show to Broadway, where it became such an enormous success that it played for 13 years on Broadway. And then it had productions, as I told you, in 21 countries all over the world. And up to that time, there had been 3 major national tours of the show. It was a magnificent success. Disney finally closed the show. It might have played longer. It's the 8th longest running Broadway musical. It might have played longer, but they had developed yet another project, which was The Little Mermaid, and they didn't think they could have 2 Disney heroines on Broadway at the same time. And so the end result was they closed Beauty and the Beast. It has gone on to have enormous success literally everywhere in the world. And what's interesting about the version of the show you're going to see is this is a total reworking of the show. So keep in mind, almost 20 years later, that same creative team that functioned as storytellers in terms of scene design, in terms of costuming, in terms of choreography, in terms of staging. They kept the original book writer, Linda Wolverton. All of them traveled all over the world to all of these 21 countries working on the show. And what they learned over all those 18 years of presenting the show in various cultures, countries, languages, was that they would make changes to the show. And the end result was every time they made a significant change, they would put it in all of the versions of the show. So what they have done with the version you're going to see is they have reimagined the visual of the show. So the sets are new, the staging is new, the songs remain the same, the dialogue remains the same, the storyline is the same. They've made tweaks to the music, and they're giving what they think is the definitive version of the show after developing it for 20 years. Now, this, of course, is almost unheard of. You know, I tell you stories that in the development of a Broadway musical, sometimes you have 6 months to workshop a show and then it opens. But in this case, we're now talking about almost a 20-year period of perfecting the show. To show you the level of perfection that Disney works for, after they had created that classic movie, when they did it on the stage, they went back and used a song that they never used in the original movie, and it was called Human again, and it's one of the greatest numbers in the show. But when they were storyboarding the movie, they couldn't quite find a way of making it an organic part of the show. But again, on the stage, it was so magical to suddenly have the chandelier become a man, probably the most singular, delightful transformation. There's a little boy in the show who's called Chip, and he's a teacup. And at the end of the show, he becomes a little boy. And every night when he appears as the little boy, the show gets wild applause and, tears from everyone. So they were so clever in bringing that song back. But because it was so popular, when they reissued the movie, Disney withdrew the original prints of the movie and reprogrammed that whole image of Human again, and they added the song to the movie. It's the only time I know of that a cartoon was withdrawn, and the most successful cartoon movie ever was withdrawn so that they could add that sequence to the film. So you'll find a special delight when you see it. Just one other little footnote that I'd like you to be aware of. In terms of the direction of the show, then, think of the director as a storyteller also. He tells his story visually by the way he stages everything. So be very sensitive to the spatial arrangements of where Beauty is, where the Beast is. Watch that brilliant moment, one of the most touching moments in the show, when Beauty tries to teach Beast how to read, and they're in the library. The staging of that moment is extraordinary. Again, that's a moment that was not in the movie, but was added to the stage version of the show. And then the choreographer, again, tells all of his stories visually by the movement of the characters in space. Especially watch the Gaston song, the funny song about this super macho hero who's really a beast. Watch the staging, the dance choreography of that number. It's really quite extraordinary. And through it all, watch how magic is used to create these illusions of fantasy and delight for you. So I guarantee you tonight that your inner child is going to come out, and what Disney will do for you through that brilliant music, through this delightful story, this sophisticated theatrical event that you're about to see, is it will take you back to those beautiful and innocent moments of your childhood. Enjoy. Thank you.
I do tricks with my fellow candlesticks. And it's all in perfect